This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on PRC review, MRC review, developing SOPs, training, audit compliance, and more. Reach out to Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. Or you can just visit our website at DarshanTalks.com or visit the law firm website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm really lucky. I get to have Brad Thompson on. Brad, I'm going to introduce him, but the reason I'm going to let him introduce himself. But the reason I was really excited is because the FDA put out a recent guidance on clinical decision support software, and what does that actually mean? And then I find out that Brad is not only the expert on that software, but also the expert on talking about AI and machine learning, which has its own implications and as they apply to this. So I'm really excited to have him on. But before we get started, Brad, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm happy to. I'm a partner with a national law firm called Epstein, Becker and Green, and technically I'm affiliated with the Washington D.C. office. If you look over my shoulder, you'll see that I work out of an Indiana home. So I've been telecommuting for 25 years, long before COVID. But I have a particular focus on medical devices, but within that on software, and especially clinical decision support. Sort of full disclosure, I have to admit, I represented a group called the CDS Coalition for about 8 years. And that group lobbied for the legislation that we'll be talking about, I think, today. So we're particularly interested stakeholders, and we've been working with the FDA over the last 6 years on the guidance document that was released just a week ago. So I've been very involved in that. And I also, late in life, I'm over 60 years old, but I just graduated in May with a master's from the University of Michigan in data science, because I really do enjoy the machine learning applications in this space. I just think there's tremendous potential for healthcare if we can harness some of the tools we have in data science. So I'm really excited about that.
That is really cool. I didn't realize that you actually were involved in the actual legislation that went into this. So that's kind of exciting to hear that part of it, and sort of hopefully you might get a sense of what the behind the scenes even looked like in terms of thought process, what the stakeholder concerns were as we get into it. Before we start talking about this, Brad, because you are the expert here, could you talk a little bit about the idea of what software the FDA even thinks that they have jurisdiction over, or that they're practicing enforcement discretion over, and why it matters as we start getting into clinical decision support software?
Yeah, so obviously that's a subject of some controversy, right? Because in my opinion, FDA thinks it has authority over more than I would agree. But to go back to before 2016, when the legislation was enacted, we're talking about the 21st Century Cures Act, and in particular Section 3060, which is the one that changed the landscape for software. FDA would have said, and did say periodically, that we want to regulate any software that makes individualized recommendations for a particular patient. And so it was that focus on individual recommendations that sort of caused the industry to be puzzled about what exactly that meant. Because you can do software that does really a continuum of things, all the way from just crunch some numbers to come up with a risk factor, for example, or general information. Your patient is a 10 out of 30 in this dimension, and it's completely up then to the professional to decide what to do with that, all the way to software which does very specifically say, shock the patient now. And you have, 10 seconds in which you really need to take action based on what the software recommends. And so there's this wide range of software. And so FDA's previous guidance that we want to regulate things which produce individualized recommendations was a bit vague, one problem. The other problem is it was overreaching. It was asking for FDA to regulate too much. And so we had long discussions with FDA over a period of several years, trying to clarify what those rules are. And we really reached an impasse where FDA either couldn't or wouldn't decide exactly what the scope would be. So we had turned our attention to Congress and worked with Congress to get that legislation enacted. And that legislation is built on what I think is kind of a simple principle, which is the division of responsibility between FDA, which regulates widgets, software, and the state boards of medicine that regulate doctors and the practice of medicine. And as you know, Darshan, for decades, it's been clear that FDA is not supposed to regulate the practice of medicine. They don't regulate doctors. We leave that to the states. We leave that specifically to the boards that oversee the practice of medicine in the states. So we needed a division of responsibility between FDA at the federal level over widgets, regulation at the state level over the doctors who make the decisions. And the guiding principle that we worked on is if a doctor is able to reach the decision themselves, isn't held hostage to a black box, then it's a matter of the practice of medicine, which should be left to the states. If it's not a black box, if the doctor is presented with a take it or leave it recommendation, then the widget ought to work, and that there's a role for FDA to make sure that it's been tested and validated and meets all the appropriate quality standards. So that's what the legislation was motivated by. This very question you asked me. I know I'm giving you a long answer for a short question, but the basic goal was to try and create that division of responsibility between the states and the federal government.
So no, and that's a really important piece, right? Because that decides everything else we talk about, because you're talking about this black box. And it's funny you use the term black box because it's going to come up again in the context of machine learning and AI, because that is exactly the issue you start facing again. But let's talk about in this case, which is we're talking about a system that goes, you put in some inputs, it does stuff, and then it spits out a recommendation of some kind. You're saying that the way it gets interpreted is that the FDA will say, and as it stands right now, the FDA will say we control all of this, and you've pushed back, and industry's pushed back, and they've said we think there are limits to that, and here are the types of limits. So I guess my question then becomes: you chose the states. Did you? And I want to clarify. When you said doctors, did you mean that as an example, or did you mean specifically you went to the AMA, if you will, a state board of medicine? And the reason I asked that question is, I routinely get pulled into questions, for example, around physical therapy. And they will say things like, oh, should the FDA be regulating this or not? And the way you read the FDA's guidance is they see it one way. But what is your take when you get asked similar questions?
Right. So you've caught me in an overstatement. I shouldn't use the word doctors. I should use the word healthcare professional.
Okay.
Because there are different boards that regulate different professionals. And so the point is, all those professionals have at the state level regulatory responsibilities that they have to meet. So I really like your clarification. My apologies for using the word doctor, but you're exactly right. So that is the division of responsibility between professional oversight at the state level and FDA regulation of widgets.
Okay, so let's now go back to the FDA's regulation of widgets, if you will. The reason we're having this conversation, out of the many reasons, including I get to talk to you, is the fact that there is this new guidance of clinical decision support software. Could you talk about what this new guidance is? It's the final guidance. So first of all, does it matter if it's final or draft from your perspective? I'll tell you the reason I ask this question. People ask me routinely, oh, there's a final guidance out there. And I go, it doesn't really, to me, matter if it's final or not, because the FDA always takes the position that it is non-binding either way. So whether it's binding as a draft or non-binding as a final, it's still non-binding. It's just the FDA's current thought process around this issue. How do you see that?
So you've kind of asked two questions. One about the impact of guidance, and the other about the impact of this particular guidance. So I'll address the broader question first. And you may not know this about me. It's just a coincidence. But back in the 1990s, I represented a group of companies that really thought there was a better way to do FDA guidance. At the time, FDA guidance was whatever they said in speeches, and they might have sent out industry letters. And you know, this was at the time when the FDA website barely existed, so you wouldn't be able to find stuff. And so I filed a citizens petition saying you really need a structure to your guidance process, and you ought to have good guidance practices. There ought to be a set way when you develop guidance, and you ought to get public input. And you, FDA, should, aim first and fire later. So you should develop guidance, get public input, and then implement the guidance document. So finalizing the guidance was meant to be the point at which FDA started to actually implement the guidance. So even though it's not binding in a court, which FDA swears up and down, and I'm fine with, it was supposed to have significance in that FDA was supposed to not change its practices until it finalized the guidance, to put everyone on notice that that was in fact what they were going to do, and to get public input before they did it in order to make sure that it was well aimed, well thought through. So I got to admit, when I saw this guidance going right to final with just huge differences from what was proposed, bear in mind, just to remind the audience, there were two proposals, one in 2017 and then one in 2019, which completely departed from 2017. So they've actually taken a couple of different cracks at this. But to add all this new stuff and subtract out all the stuff that they had previously and go right to final and say, we're going to start implementing this, that's arrogant, because they're not interested in what anyone has to say about this, about these changes. And the changes are massive. And so for FDA to do that is horrible from a good governance standpoint, let alone a good guidance standpoint. So they're clearly violating the good guidance practices by going right to final with major changes. Now, you asked me about this particular guidance. So the statute basically says there are 4 criterion that define when software is excluded from FDA regulation. The first criterion is basically to exclude whether the product is analyzing a signal or an image. And FDA, back in the legislative process leading up to this, said, look, we've been regulating software that analyzes medical images for 20 years. X-ray images, mammography, it's a long-standing practice of FDA to regulate software which looks at those images and makes recommendations about whether there are benign lesions or tumors or whatever it might, the purpose of the software, the purpose of the exam might be. So they said, we got to take that off the plate. And everyone said, fine, that makes sense. We're going to take images and reading an ECG signal. We're going to take all that out of the equation. FDA still regulates that. So second, FDA said, as a criterion, it should, if there's analysis involved, right, of medical information, analysis of medical information. If then the fourth criterion is where the user doesn't have the user has to rely on the output because there isn't a reliable way for them to understand the basis for the recommendation. So the fourth criterion is sort of what I call the transparency criterion, or the black box criterion, where the user has to be held hostage to this. What FDA has done is shifted a lot of its attention from that fourth criterion, which is the transparency, to the first 3 criterion to try and limit what can even be considered for exclusion from FDA regulation. And that's the really bad part about what they did, is they invented a bunch of stuff that Congress did not intend and said, look, if these things are present, we're going to regulate it, regardless of the statutory language, and regardless of the fact that FDA participated aggressively and fully in the development of that statutory language 6 years ago. They're completely repudiating that agreement and coming up with this entirely new paradigm that really dramatically limits the software that can fall within the exclusion. That's really problematic for healthcare, for patients, for providers, for everyone.
So let's explore that a little bit further. So my first question is sort of a pushback, if you will, mostly to get your reaction out of it. But
I like pushback.
but I guess my question is, in the end, the courts always say we defer to the FDA, we defer to agencies in their interpretation of the law and therefore their guidances. If that's true, do you think that there will be a argument from the FDA going, this is how we interpret it, like it or not, that's our interpretation. Challenge us if you want to. Do you feel like that might be their position? And if so, do you expect a lot of challenges?
I have no doubt, and I'm going to state this pejoratively, that FDA is acting like a bully here and saying, what are you going to do about it? I have no doubt about that. But on the law, as you well know from administrative law, while there's deference in the case of ambiguity and where the agency comes up with a reasonable interpretation in light of the ambiguity as to what it should mean, the court will defer to a reasonable position the agency takes in the face of ambiguity. None of that is present here. The statute is not ambiguous, not in these respects, and FDA is not being anything close to reasonable in what it wants to add to the language. So the basis for deferring to FDA is just not there. But to your point, what are you going to do about it? What are any of us going to do about it? For one thing, just from a lawyer standpoint, this, guidance documents, FDA, because you pointed out that they're not legally binding, are not final agency actions, and we can't go immediately to court. We can't go to court and challenge an FDA guidance document, even when it's final, right? In fact, it's also the law that warning letters, even a warning letter, is not a final agency action. That if you're a company, you have to wait until you're really in the crosshairs of a seizure action or a recall, an agency ordered recall, or some enforcement action before you can go to court and say, look, FDA's not following the law. Well, that's the horrible part about all of this is that FDA's being a bully, and they know that they can get away with it. So the only way you deal with a bully is go to the bully's boss. And in this case, that's Congress, right? To go to Congress and say, look, in these halls of Congress, we had this discussion 6 years ago. This is the language everyone came up with. FDA is just flat out ignoring it.
Yeah.
Congress, will you help us with the agency?
And what has been your experience dealing with Congress on issues like this? Are they open to this, or do they kind of go, look, we figured this out. We've got other bigger fish to fry, if you will. There's AI, there's First Amendment, there's so many other things we can go after. Do we really want to keep regulating this?
It's really hard to talk about Congress in a singular way because, it's over 500 individuals. They each have their different hot button issues. They're each different interests and so forth. There's the party lines to consider. But there are plenty in Congress who don't like FDA overreach that negatively impacts innovation. And that's what's going on here, right? So when you think about it, all the people who love innovation, who think innovation is a big key to improving healthcare, right? To improving the care that patients get, that the system isn't great right now, and we need to come up with better ways of ensuring quality care and reducing errors in medical decision making and so forth. And to have FDA arrogantly ignore Congress, then you would think there would be people in Congress who would say, no, not on my watch.
I love that. So let's go back to the guidance itself, because we could go off on these tangents of just FDA overreach, because I have so many different examples we can go into. But ignoring that part of it for a second, you mentioned the 4 criteria. And I recognize you aren't necessarily looking at the guidance as you talk about this, but just in case, do you happen to remember what the 4 criteria are for those people who are listening and going, I haven't read the guidance yet?
I can't remember, but I can read them. So I'll read them to you.
Cool.
The 4 basic criteria are: number 1, that it's not intended to acquire, process, or analyze a medical image. And I'm going to truncate it because it's legislative language. But the first one is all about excluding, as I said, those things which are image analysis or signal analysis. The second criteria is that it's intended for the purpose of displaying or analyzing, and analyzing is really the key word here, medical information about a patient or other medical information. So analyzing medical information. The third criterion is that it's for the purpose of supporting or providing a recommendation to a healthcare professional. So, we had a big discussion 6 years ago, should it include information provided to patients, because a lot of software is targeting patients. And we all agreed that really when we're talking about recommendations for this purpose, because the issue is state regulation of healthcare professionals, this ought to be limited to recommendations to those professionals. And then the fourth one is the transparency one. It's for the purpose of enabling the healthcare professional to independently review the basis for the recommendation. So if it's not a black box, if they can review the basis for the recommendation such that they don't have to primarily rely on the software, it's excluded. So those are the 4 criteria.
So just to clarify, these 4 criteria, if you meet any one of them, the impact, no. So
you have to meet all 4. It's an and, not an or. So you have to check each box.
Okay. So you have to check each box of these, and then what happens? That the FDA does not have jurisdiction?
Correct. It's not a
Okay.
medical device. This is an amendment to the definition of a medical device. So it excludes anything that meets these 4 criteria from the definition of a medical device.
Okay. So what I think we're seeing as the next step is the AI and machine learning that's going to be used to augment exactly these devices. And as we've mentioned before, and we don't want to, as lawyers, we never want to use the word expert, so we can't say expert, but you are a skilled practitioner in that space, shall we
That's
say?
kind of you.
But could you talk a little bit about what the impact of something like that will be? Because in the recent past, for those people who are following, the White House just came out with a position statement on AI. Europe just came out with a position statement on AI, and sort of everyone's talking about it. What does it actually mean? What are the implications going to be for health, and how does it affect actual healthcare decisions going forward?
6 years ago, when this legislation was enacted, I thought this would be the issue we'd be talking about right now, would be how do you apply the 4th criterion, the transparency criterion, to a machine learning algorithm that maybe the user couldn't necessarily understand how the algorithm was constructed. Could you ever have transparency where there's a algorithm involved? I thought that's what we'd be talking about. So what FDA has done is shifted the debate to the first 3 criterion to say, you know what, we don't even want to go there. We don't even want to worry about the 4th criterion. We're going to knock most software out in the first 3 criterion as not qualifying. So what they did, and I'll say this to their credit, I try and be balanced in my comments. I think the agency's approach to the 4th criterion in light of artificial intelligence is actually pretty good. Because what the FDA says under that 4th criterion is the doctor doesn't need to understand how the software actually works and how it's coded and how it produces an outcome. But here's a list of 5 or 6 things which you can communicate to a user, which allows them to understand whether the output of the machine learning algorithm is going to be appropriate or not, reliable, sensible, applicable. So, you talk about things like, what were the data that the algorithm was trained on? Was it trained on the different racial profiles? Or if it was only trained on Caucasians, it should only be used, therefore, when interpreting data on Caucasians, or any number of different demographics about patients. So relaying the, if it's based on clinical guidelines, revealing what those clinical guidelines are and making sure those clinical guidelines are accessible. So if the software is predicated on the fact that some particular diabetes guideline recommends this particular dosage of insulin, but the doctor can go look at the guidelines and say, yeah, that's how I read them as well. I agree, that's an appropriate interpretation, or I don't agree, or whatever it might be, right? So FDA's approach to transparency, the 4th criterion, is much better in this draft than it was 3 years ago. Now, that's not a coincidence, because FDA excluded so many things in the first 3 criterion that they're, I guess, willing to be more generous on the 4th criterion, because it isn't going to matter as much. It isn't going to be applicable to most software. But they came up with, to give credit where credit's due, I thought a reasonable way of saying, look, you disclose the basis on which it is, tell them what kind of algorithm it is. Is it a neural network? Tell them, a little bit about how it was done. And then they can make a reasonable decision about whether or not to rely on the output of that software. So I'm kind of a fan of that portion of the guidance.
So it's interesting you say that, because I think what you're describing is the way they want to address the black box issue is by talking a little bit more about the training and being transparent about the training associated with it. I went to pharmacy school, and I can tell you that when I look at that stuff, I'm either going to trust the software because the hospital told me use it, or I'm going to not. The idea that I'm going to look at everything they have and then look at the adequacy of the training to evaluate whether it's appropriate is something I would struggle with at a clinical level. Has there been any discussion obviously the makers of the software would argue that, well, that's on you. You probably should take more efforts. But Has there been any discussion on whether that is deemed to be adequate, and how should that be managed at the clinical level?
So FDA's guidance isn't very helpful on that topic. I have that discussion with clients all the time because in practice, it is, a P&T committee at an institution that evaluates and decides whether the software is appropriate or not. And so the question is that adequate? That someone, not the treating physician necessarily, but someone at the customer location made the decision about whether it's appropriately applicable. I think you sort of divide it and say, the P&T committee ought to look at the demographics, ought to look at, is it adequately trained across all races? And if not, then that P&T committee ought to either reject it, not buy it, or give their doctors guidance, never use it on this population because it really hasn't been tested on that population. So I think that works. At a more sort of clinical specific level, though, every doctor has to, sort of carefully gauge the reasonableness of the output based on the input. So I described the training data, but the other input is the patient-specific data. Is it clear that all the right data were inputted for that particular patient? Garbage in, garbage out. If you feed the wrong thing into the algorithm, it's going to give you a crazy output. So there is a lot of stuff that the doctor himself or herself should do and can't just say that's somebody else's job. I firmly believe that. But then there are other higher level assessments that they can rely, in my opinion, on the institution to review, kick the tires, and then give me direction as the doctor on whether I ought to be using it or not.
I love it. We can obviously keep talking about this for loads more time, but we're well past time already, and you are, as expected, an incredible speaker. So Brad, thank you so much for coming on.
Kind of you.
Before we continue, or before we call it, do you have any parting words?
No, I mean, I'm just honestly, I'm sort of sitting back because I've spoken my piece. I'm sort of sitting back to see how others in this industry are taking this guidance and whether others are seeing it the same way. So I'll be interested in the comments that are received. One of the things we didn't talk about is one of the criterion that FDA just added out of the blue is you can't use this with software that's used in time critical situations. Well, I Googled and looked up the amount of software used in an emergency department, and it's right there in the name, emergency department. So to my way of thinking, you read the guidance, software used in an emergency department can't be exempt, no matter what. That's kind of how I'm taking the guidance. Well, I'm interested to know whether that bothers anyone else. If it doesn't bother anyone, then I'll just shut up and go back to doing other things. But I gotta believe there's a lot of folks out there with unapproved software for the emergency department that ought to be looking at that guidance and sort of assessing whether they're out of business or not. And so we'll see what others think. I'm anxious to hear.
That's awesome. These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an attorney-client relationship.